When you hear the name Taft, what comes to mind? For most of us, it's a name that feels like a sepia-toned photograph from a distant past, a solid, respectable, almost institutional word etched onto the marble friezes of American history. It conjures an image of the Gilded Age, of sober men in dark suits and formidable women in corsets, their faces etched with the seriousness of a nation coming into its own. We see a legacy of law and jurisprudence, of a stoic Midwestern republicanism that feels as foundational and as unmovable as the bedrock of the Ohio River Valley from which it sprang. It's a landscape of such profound historical propriety, of such quiet, competent service, that we rarely stop to consider the extraordinary, almost paradoxical, human drama at its heart. We see a political family, but what we're really looking at is the only dynasty in the history of the United States to conquer the absolute twin peaks of American power, the presidency and the chief justiceship of the Supreme Court. This is the story of the Tafts, a name that has become synonymous with a unique and unrepeated concentration of constitutional power, a political empire built not on populist charisma or vast commercial wealth, but on sheer intellect, relentless ambition, and an unwavering, almost religious belief in the sanctity of the rule of law. Their influence quietly shaped the very structure of the American government, its role in the world, and the ideological fault lines of its politics for over a century. We see the halls of power in Washington, the governor's mansion in Ohio, and the colonial outposts of a rising American empire, all stamped with the unmistakable Taft family seal. But what if I told you the real story of the Taft family is not one of a simple, linear ascent to greatness? Today we are pulling back the heavy velvet curtain on one of America's most accomplished and deeply misunderstood political dynasties. This is the story of how a patriarch's fierce ambition forged a path to greatness for his sons, and how that path led to a pinnacle of power that was at once a crowning achievement and a gilded, suffocating cage. This is the Taft Dynasty, the family that conquered Washington, and the secret burden of the crown. To understand the world-altering force that the Taft Dynasty would become, you must first transport yourself to an America on the anvil, a nation being hammered into a new and unfamiliar shape. Imagine the world into which the family's destiny was forged, the raw, chaotic, and brutal landscape of the 19th century. This was an America grappling with its own soul in the aftermath of a bloody civil war, a nation hurtling into an age of untamed industrial capitalism, of sprawling cities black with coal smoke, and of political machines that ran on graft and patronage. It was the era that Mark Twain would christen the Gilded Age, a time of staggering fortunes and appalling poverty, where the rules of this new world were still being written, often in the language of power and greed. The air was thick with the smoke of industry and the fervent, often violent, debates about the nation's future. It was a world that demanded men of iron will, of towering intellect, and of an almost religious devotion to the idea of public service as a civilizing, ordering force against the chaos. It was in this crucible that Alphonso Taft forged his destiny, and with it, the destiny of his family. He was the dynasty's architect, the stern, unyielding patriarch who drew the blueprints for all that was to come. He was not born into the Boston Brahmin aristocracy or the landed gentry of Virginia. Born in 1810 in the humble, rocky soil of rural Vermont, his was a story of pure, unadulterated meritocracy. He was a product of the fierce intellectual tradition of Puritan New England, a brilliant and ferociously disciplined student who worked his way through Yale University, graduating with honors. But Alphonso was possessed by a restless ambition that the quiet, ordered hills of Vermont could not possibly contain. Like so many of his generation, he looked west, towards the raw, chaotic energy of the frontier. In 1838, with little more than his education and an unshakable belief in his own abilities, he moved to the booming river city of Cincinnati, Ohio. It was a gateway to the West, a sprawling, brawling city of commerce and opportunity, a place where a man with a sharp legal mind and a relentless work ethic could carve out an empire. Alphonso was the quintessential patriarch of his Victorian era, stern, deeply principled, emotionally reserved, and relentlessly driven. He established a successful law practice and quickly became a pillar of Cincinnati society, a founder of its most prestigious clubs and cultural institutions. But his ambition was always aimed at a larger, more consequential stage. He was not a flashy, charismatic politician. He was a jurist, a man who believed in institutions, in order, and in the nascent Republican Party as the sacred guardian of the Union he revered. His moment on the national stage arrived when his old friend from Ohio, President Ulysses S. Grant, called him to a crisis-ridden Washington in the mid-1870s. He served with quiet distinction as Grant's Secretary of War and later as his Attorney General, a thankless task of trying to restore integrity and order to a government rocked by a relentless series of corruption scandals. It was a profound first-hand lesson in the burdens, the frustrations, and the solemn honor of public life. Later, he served his country as a diplomat, an envoy to the grand, fading courts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Vienna and Imperial Russia in St. Petersburg. For his children growing up in a home where cabinet meetings and diplomatic cables from European capitals were common dinner table conversation, this was a masterclass in power, duty, and purpose. Imagine being a young, impressionable boy, like his favored son, William Howard, hearing letters read aloud describing the opulent Hofburg Palace or the frosty, imposing grandeur of the Winter Palace. Alphonso Taft didn't just give his sons a comfortable life and a first-class education. He gave them a worldview, a sense of their place in the grand sweep of history. He instilled in them a deep-seated, almost sacred sense of noblesse oblige. He taught them that to be a Taft was to serve the nation, to uphold the law as the highest expression of civilization, and to be a steward of its fragile institutions. He was the architect, meticulously drawing up the blueprints for a dynasty. He built the foundation of wealth, sterling reputation, and powerful political connections. And upon that formidable foundation, his sons were not invited but expected to build an empire. He wasn't just raising sons, he was forging his legacy. And the pressure on them, especially on his brilliant, amiable, and favored son William, was as immense as it was unspoken. The stage was set not for a choice, but for a destiny that had been designed for them before they were even born. And yet, Alphonso's path was not one of unbroken victory. It was paved with the hard lessons of political defeat, lessons that would profoundly shape the dynasty's future strategy. Twice he ran for governor of Ohio, and twice he was defeated, his stern judicial temperament failing to connect with the broader electorate. These losses taught him a crucial lesson, one he would pass on to his sons, that intellectual superiority and moral rectitude alone were not enough to win the messy game of democratic politics. It required alliances, a powerful network, and often a more charismatic public face. This realization may well have been the seed of the powerful partnership between his cerebral son William and the larger-than-life Theodore Roosevelt. Alphonso learned through his own failures that a dynasty needed more than just a brilliant mind. It needed a popular champion, a lesson that would echo through the generations. His principles were most fiercely tested and displayed not in the political arena, but in the courtroom. In a famous 1870 case in Cincinnati, he stood as a judge against the overwhelming tide of public opinion. The city school board had voted to end the practice of daily Bible readings in public schools, sparking a furious backlash from the city's religious leaders. While other judges wavered, Alphonso Taft, in a powerful dissent that would become a landmark in the debate over church and state, argued that the government had no business imposing any form of religious orthodoxy. "The government is neutral," he wrote, "and while protecting all, it prefers none, and it disparages none." In an era of intense and often coercive public piety, it was an act of profound intellectual courage. It was a clear signal, sent to his sons and to the world, that for a Taft, the law, sober, impartial, and secular, stood above even the most passionate demands of the majority. This was the intellectual DNA he was passing down, a reverence for the institution over the impulse of the crowd. This unshakable integrity made him the perfect man for an impossible job when President Grant called him to Washington. Grant's second term was drowning in a sea of corruption, with the whiskey ring scandal and other schemes implicating some of the highest officials in the land. Alphonso was brought in as a cleaner, a man whose reputation was so spotless that his very presence was meant to signal a return to honesty. Imagine the pressure of stepping into that ethical vacuum, tasked with restoring faith in a government that the public increasingly saw as a den of thieves. He played a crucial stabilizing role in the chaotic and disputed presidential election of 1876, a constitutional crisis that brought the nation to the brink. For his children watching from afar, this was the ultimate lesson in what it meant to be a Taft, to be the one man who could be trusted when the entire system seemed to be collapsing, to be a bulwark of order against the tide of chaos and corruption. His service was not just a career achievement, it was the forging of the family brand. The second generation of the Taft family was its golden age, the era where the patriarch's towering ambitions were realized on a scale that even he, in his most audacious moments, might have found astonishing. But this historic triumph was not the story of a single solitary man. It was a complex, fascinating interplay of personalities, a veritable family court with its own brilliant but reluctant king, its fiercely ambitious queen, and its indispensable behind-the-scenes chancellor. Together they would propel the Taft name to a height of power unique in the American story. At the very center of this constellation was William Howard Taft. Born in 1857, Will, as he was known to his family and friends, was everything his demanding father could have hoped for. He was physically imposing, standing over 6 feet tall and eventually weighing over 300 pounds, a giant of a man with a brilliant legal mind and an infectious, booming, jovial laugh that could charm the most hardened of political opponents. He followed his father's well-trodden path to Yale University, where he was not just a scholar, but a beloved campus figure. He was an accomplished athlete, a member of the secretive and powerful Skull and Bones Society, and he graduated second in his class of 121. He was, by all accounts, a legal prodigy. The law was not just a profession to him, it was his native language. Its logic, its precedents, and its intricate order were the very architecture of his mind. His early career was a dizzying, near vertical ascent through the legal and judicial world. He became a county prosecutor, then a judge on the Ohio Superior Court, and then at the astonishingly young age of 32, he was appointed by President Benjamin Harrison to be the Solicitor General of the United States, the nation's top courtroom lawyer. His path seemed clear, his destiny immutably set. Every fiber of his being, every professional and personal inclination, yearned for a seat on the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States. It was, he would write repeatedly throughout his life in countless private letters, his ultimate ambition, the dearest wish of his heart. It was a role for which he was perfectly suited by temperament and intellect. But fate, and more pointedly his family, had other, grander, and far more public plans for him. The true driving force behind his political ascent was not his own ambition, but the relentless, steel-willed ambition of his wife, Helen Nellie Heron Taft. Nellie was a formidable and brilliant woman, a product of a politically connected Cincinnati family. She was sharp, cultured, fiercely intelligent, and deeply frustrated with the severely limited roles available to women of her era, no matter how gifted. Her father had been a law partner of President Rutherford B. Hayes, and she had grown up in the intoxicating orbit of national power, even visiting the White House as a young woman. She saw in her brilliant, amiable, and sometimes maddeningly unambitious husband the perfect vessel for her own deferred dreams. While Will dreamed of the quiet, scholarly, and cloistered life of a judge, Nellie dreamed of the White House with a burning, all-consuming passion. She was his strategist, his manager, his confidant, and his conscience, constantly pushing him away from the judicial bench and towards the political arena. Theirs was a partnership of deep and genuine affection, but it was also one defined by a profound, unspoken tension between his placid nature and her iron will. The other key figure in his court, a man who was not family by blood, but by a bond of deep political and personal friendship, was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, the vibrant, energetic, almost superhuman force of nature, saw in the calm, methodical Taft a loyal friend, a brilliant administrator, and a perfect complement to his own impulsive personality. He became Will's mentor, his champion, and his ticket to the highest echelons of power. When Roosevelt became president after the assassination of William McKinley in 1901, he made Taft his indispensable right-hand man. He sent him to the newly acquired Philippines as the first civilian governor-general, a monumental and thankless task of nation-building in the wake of a brutal insurrection. Taft, with his blend of administrative genius, legal acumen, and genuine affection for the Filipino people, was a resounding success, establishing a civil government and winning the trust of many locals. Roosevelt then brought him back to Washington to be his Secretary of War, a role that in Roosevelt's administration made him effectively the troubleshooter-in-chief for the entire government. Twice during these years of service to Roosevelt, the president offered Taft his life's dream on a silver platter, a nomination to a vacant seat on the Supreme Court. It was a moment of exquisite agony for Taft, and twice, urged on by a determined Nellie who saw it as a premature end to their upward trajectory, and by his own powerful sense of duty to Roosevelt, who said he was too valuable to lose, he reluctantly, painfully, turned it down. The presidency, a job he had never wanted and privately dreaded, was becoming an inescapable destiny, a gilded cage that was slowly closing around him. While William was serving the president in Washington and Manila, his older half-brother, Charles Phelps Taft, was quietly building the other, indispensable half of the family's power base back in Ohio. Charles was the practical, shrewd, and immensely wealthy businessman to William's idealistic jurist. He had married into the immense Sinton family fortune and had become the publisher of the Cincinnati Times-Star, which he built into one of the most powerful and influential newspapers in the entire Midwest. He was the family's chancellor, its financial engine, and its propaganda minister. He used his newspaper as a powerful an unapologetic tool of political promotion, relentlessly burnishing William's public image, celebrating his achievements, and savaging his political opponents. He provided the seemingly endless river of cash, the media savvy, and the crucial behind-the-scenes political maneuvering that cleared the path for his younger brother. While William was the face of the dynasty, Charles was its formidable, invisible backbone. In 1908, the powerful and perfectly synchronized machine that this family court had built reached its apotheosis. Theodore Roosevelt, honoring his public promise not to seek what would have been a third term, stunned the political world by handpicking Taft as his chosen successor. With Roosevelt's thunderous, full-throated endorsement, the Republican Party's powerful machinery, and Charles's media empire all aligned behind him, William Howard Taft was easily elected the 27th President of the United States. The son of ALPHONSO Taft had reached the summit of American power. Nellie Taft's lifelong dream had been triumphantly realized. She had her husband in the White House. But for the new president, the man who now held the most powerful office on earth, the victory felt less like a coronation and more like the beginning of a long and difficult sentence. He found the presidency to be a profoundly lonely, isolating, and burdensome office. He was a judge forced by fate and family to be a king, and the crown from the very first day rested uneasily upon his head. Nellie, however, was in her element. She was not content to be a passive first lady. She intended to be a partner in power, a co-ruler in all but name. She broke with tradition immediately, choosing to ride back to the White House from the Capitol, sitting next to her husband in the carriage, a place previously reserved for the outgoing president. It was a small but powerful symbol of her intent. She had grand plans, not just for the social life of the White House, but for its physical landscape, famously arranging for the planting of the iconic Japanese cherry trees that still blossom in Washington, D.C. every spring. But just a few months into the presidency, tragedy struck. Nellie suffered a debilitating stroke that left her unable to speak clearly for over a year. For a woman whose power was her intellect and her voice, it was a devastating blow. And for her husband, the reluctant president, it was a profound crisis. He lost not just his wife's companionship, but his primary political advisor and his greatest source of strength, leaving him more isolated than ever in a role he already disliked. His patient and devoted nursing of her back to health is one of the great quiet love stories of the American presidency, but the political cost was immense. Taft's tenure in the Philippines reveals the paradox of the man. Far from the political battles of Washington, he found a sense of purpose and fulfillment he rarely did elsewhere. He genuinely grew to love the islands and their people, referring to them as his little brown brothers. He learned to waltz, took up golf, and famously sent a telegram back to the Secretary of War that read, "Stood trip well, rode horseback 25 miles to 5,000-foot elevation." The reply from Washington dryly noted, referring to your telegram, "How is the horse?" But beneath the humor was a serious mission. He was an enlightened colonial administrator, focused on building roads, schools, and a functioning government, earning a degree of trust and affection that was rare in that age of empire. It was here, as a proconsul ruling a distant land, that he could be the benevolent judge-king he was always meant to be, applying the law and administrative order without the messy business of democratic politics. This experience, more than any other, highlights the central conflict of his soul. He was a brilliant and humane ruler who had little taste for being a politician. And then there was Charles, the silent partner. His influence went far beyond simply writing favorable editorials. He was a master of the new form of American capitalism, with interests in real estate, banking, and even professional baseball, owning stakes in both the Chicago Cubs and the Philadelphia Phillies. This vast business network gave him an ear to the ground in the circles of power and finance that William, the career public servant, lacked. When William's presidential campaign needed a sudden infusion of cash to counter a rival, it was Charles who quietly signed the checks. When a damaging rumor began to circulate in the press, it was Charles's editors who worked behind the scenes to quash it. He was the dynasty's shield and its sword, operating in the shadows so that his younger brother could remain in the light. This arrangement, however, also created a subtle dependency. William was the famous one, the one destined for the history books. But he was never entirely his own man. He was, in many ways, the final perfect product of a family machine that had been designed and funded by others, a machine that now demanded he fulfill a destiny that was not his own. For every great dynasty, for every seemingly unstoppable rise, there is a moment of crisis, a point where the very foundations are tested, and the hidden cracks begin to spiderweb their way to the surface. For the Taft dynasty, that fracture was not a slow, gentle decline, but a sudden, violent, and deeply personal political earthquake. It was a schism that would pit friend against friend, mentor against protege, and in doing so, reveal the profound hidden costs of the power they had so painstakingly acquired. The very forces that had conspired to lift William Howard Taft to the presidency, his unwavering loyalty, his judicial temperament, and his relationship with Theodore Roosevelt, would be the very things to tear his political world and the Republican Party apart. This was not a conflict that erupted overnight. Its seeds were sown in the fundamental differences between the two men, differences that their deep friendship had long masked. Roosevelt was a force of nature, a man who saw the presidency as a bully pulpit from which to lead a moral crusade. He believed in the stewardship theory of power, that a president could do anything not explicitly forbidden by the Constitution to serve the people. Taft, the jurist, was his polar opposite. He was a creature of the court, a man who believed the president was strictly bound by the letter of the law. Where Roosevelt saw a canvas for bold action, Taft saw the rigid lines of constitutional authority. While Roosevelt was in office, this difference was a strength. Taft was the loyal, methodical administrator who could execute his friend's grand visions. But once Taft himself was president, this philosophical chasm became a gaping, unbridgeable canyon. The relationship between William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt was, for years, one of the great and most consequential bromances in all of American political history. It was a bond of deep and genuine affection, of shared purpose, and of mutual, if sometimes grudging, respect. Roosevelt believed that in Taft he had found not just a loyal friend, but a political heir who would faithfully and diligently carry on his progressive square deal policies of regulating big business and conserving natural resources. He was, as history would prove, tragically and catastrophically mistaken. The two men, for all their years of close friendship, possessed fundamentally different and ultimately incompatible views of presidential power. Roosevelt was the great champion of the stewardship theory of the presidency. He believed that the president was the steward of the people and could do anything and everything not explicitly forbidden by the Constitution to serve the public good. He was a force of nature, eager to stretch the limits of his office and bend the levers of government to his formidable will. Taft, the consummate lawyer and future Chief Justice, was a strict constitutionalist. He believed the president was bound by the letter of the law and could only do that which was explicitly permitted by the Constitution or by an act of Congress. Where Roosevelt saw a bully pulpit from which to rally the nation, Taft saw a judge's bench from which to soberly and cautiously administer the law. This deep philosophical gulf, once Taft was in office and no longer Roosevelt's subordinate, quickly became a gaping political chasm. Once in the White House, Taft, true to his legalistic nature, governed not as a progressive firebrand, but as a cautious conservative. He continued Roosevelt's policy of trust-busting, even bringing more antitrust suits in his one term than Roosevelt had in two, but he did so with the cold logic of a prosecutor, not the fiery passion of a crusader. One of these suits against U.S. Steel infuriated Roosevelt, as it implicitly challenged a merger that Roosevelt himself had personally approved while in office, making it seem like a personal attack on his judgment. Furthermore, Taft, a believer in party regularity, aligned himself with the more conservative, business-friendly, old guard wing of the Republican Party, led by figures like Senator Nelson Aldrich. This was most evident in his handling of the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act of 1909. Progressives had hoped for deep cuts to tariffs, but the final bill was a compromise that kept rates high. Taft, despite his own misgivings, signed it, and then, in a moment of stunning political tone deafness, praised it as the best tariff bill the Republican Party ever passed. Progressives were enraged. From his self-imposed exile on a grand African safari, Roosevelt began to hear a steady stream of whispers, then urgent shouts of betrayal. His progressive friends and allies, who now felt abandoned by the Taft administration, sent him a flood of letters, telling him that his hand-picked successor was systematically dismantling his legacy. The final unforgivable break came in 1910 over what became known as the Ballinger-Pinchot affair. Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger, was accused by the nation's chief forester, Gifford Pinchot, of improperly using his office to help business interests gain access to protected coal fields in Alaska. Pinchot was not just any government official. He was a pioneering conservationist, a crusading progressive, and one of Theodore Roosevelt's closest and most beloved friends and confidants. Taft, after a review, sided with his cabinet secretary Ballinger. When Pinchot continued to publicly attack Ballinger, essentially accusing the administration of corruption, Taft felt he had no choice. He fired Pinchot for insubordination. To Roosevelt, this was more than a policy disagreement or a personnel matter. It was a deeply personal attack, a declaration of war on the cause of conservation and on Roosevelt himself. He returned to America a changed man, a political warrior, convinced that his old friend Taft was a puzzle-wit and a fathead who had sold out the progressive cause to the corporate interests of the old guard. The resulting conflict was a political spectacle of Shakespearean proportions, a battle for the soul of the Republican Party. In the 1912 election, Roosevelt, roaring that his hat was in the ring, did the unthinkable. He challenged the sitting president of his own party, Taft, for the Republican nomination. The battle for the nomination was one of the ugliest and most brutal in political history. When the party establishment, which was firmly controlled by Taft, ultimately handed the nomination to the incumbent president at a chaotic and bitter Chicago convention, Roosevelt refused to accept defeat. He stormed out of the convention, held his own rally, and announced he would run for president on a third-party ticket, the Progressive Party, which quickly became known as the Bull Moose Party. The friendship was irrevocably, publicly, and brutally shattered. The two men who had once been as close as brothers now savaged each other in the press and on the campaign trail. Roosevelt's insurgency split the Republican vote right down the middle, creating a clear path to victory for the Democratic candidate, the intellectual and idealistic Woodrow Wilson. In the end, Taft suffered the most humiliating defeat of any incumbent president in American history. He finished a distant third, winning only 2 states, Utah and Vermont, and a mere 8 electoral votes. The great political machine the Tafts had so carefully built over 2 generations now lay in ruins, destroyed by the very man who had been its chief architect and most powerful champion. The pain of this betrayal ran incredibly deep on both sides. For Taft, a man who valued loyalty and personal relationships above all else, Roosevelt's public attacks felt like a dagger to the heart. He was genuinely baffled and wounded, believing he had governed honorably and according to his constitutional duty. In private letters, he lamented the loss of his old friend with a profound sadness. "I do not see how I'm going to get through this campaign," he wrote to a relative. "It is a nightmare." He called Roosevelt a dangerous egotist and a demagogue, but the insults felt defensive, the pained reactions of a man who couldn't comprehend how their bond had so utterly dissolved. For him, the political battle was a personal tragedy he was forced to endure. Roosevelt, on the other hand, channeled his sense of betrayal into a righteous, almost holy fury. He saw Taft's actions not as a mere difference of opinion, but as a moral failure, a betrayal of the American people. The insults he hurled were far more cutting and personal. He mocked Taft's physical size, calling him a fathead with the brains of a guinea pig. In a speech in Carnegie Hall, he declared that Taft was a flub-dub with a streak of the second rate, who had surrendered to the bosses and the special interests. He was on a crusade, and in his mind, Taft was no longer a friend who had lost his way. He was an enemy of progress who needed to be vanquished. It was a shocking and brutal public spectacle as 2 giants of American politics, once the closest of allies, used their immense platforms to try and destroy one another. The 1912 Republican Convention in Chicago became the stage for this political drama's final explosive act. The atmosphere was electric, a tinderbox of raw emotion and political intrigue. The Taft forces, controlling the party machinery, ruthlessly wielded their power to disqualify Roosevelt-pledged delegates. Roosevelt arrived in the city to a hero's welcome, greeted by tens of thousands of cheering supporters. He was defiant and ready for a fight, famously telling a reporter, "I'm as strong as a bull moose," giving his new party its enduring nickname. In a fiery speech to his followers, he thundered, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." It was no longer politics. It was a holy war. When the convention floor ultimately tilted to Taft, the Roosevelt delegates sat in stunned, angry silence. Their hero had been robbed not by the will of the voters, but by the backroom dealings of the party bosses. The schism was now complete and irreparable. The consequences of this shattered friendship echoed for decades. It didn't just elect Woodrow Wilson, it fundamentally cleaved the Republican Party in 2, creating a bitter divide between its progressive and conservative wings that arguably persists to this day. The old guard conservatives who had backed Taft solidified their control over the party machinery, pushing it in a more business-friendly, isolationist direction for years to come. The vibrant, reformist energy that Roosevelt had championed was cast out into the political wilderness. It was a cautionary tale written in the language of ambition and betrayal, a stark reminder of how the rupturing of a single powerful friendship can alter the political landscape of a nation for generations. The public humiliation of the 1912 election cast a long and defining shadow over the next generation of the Taft family. As William Howard Taft gracefully and gratefully retreated from the political stage, his eldest and most politically astute son, Robert A. Taft, stepped forward, driven by a fierce desire to reclaim the family's honor and to achieve the one prize his father had held but never truly valued, the presidency. If his father was the reluctant politician, a judge in a politician's clothing, Robert was a political animal to his very core. He was a man of fierce, almost daunting intellect, of unbending conservative principles, and of a burning, all-consuming ambition to sit in the Oval Office. Robert A. Taft was, without exaggeration, the intellectual godfather of modern American conservatism. He was brilliant, deeply principled, and often seen as cold, aloof, and overly intellectual in a way his jovial, backslapping father never was. After a distinguished career in Ohio state politics, he was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1938, just as the nation was grappling with the immense changes wrought by Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. He quickly established himself as the leader of the conservative opposition, a tireless and intellectually rigorous critic of what he saw as the dangerous expansion of federal power and the drift towards socialism. He was a fierce isolationist in the years leading up to World War II, arguing passionately against American entanglement in foreign wars. After the war, he became the leading voice for a more restrained foreign policy and a staunch opponent of organized labor, co-authoring the landmark Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, which curtailed the power of unions. His colleagues in the Senate, in a mixture of awe and respect for his commanding intellectual prowess and his unwavering ideological consistency, nicknamed him Mr. Republican. For millions of conservatives across the country, he was not just a politician. He was their heart, their soul, and their brain. His entire life's ambition, the singular goal towards which all his efforts were directed, was to win the presidency. He sought the Republican nomination 3 separate times, and each time he was denied in a heartbreaking, almost cruel fashion. In 1940, as the war in Europe loomed, his isolationist stance was out of step with the moment, and he lost the nomination to the more charismatic and internationalist dark horse, Wendell Willkie. In 1948, he was the favorite of the party's conservative base, but he was outmaneuvered in a stunning upset by the more moderate New York governor, Thomas Dewey, who then went on to lose the general election to Harry Truman. But his most agonizing and final defeat came in 1952. By then, he was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the Republican Party's conservative wing. He had the loyalty of the party faithful, the state party organizations, and the nomination seemed at long last to be within his grasp. But the party's moderate, internationalist Eastern establishment wing, led by figures like Dewey, was terrified of a Taft presidency. They feared his non-interventionist foreign policy was dangerously naive for the height of the Cold War, and they believed his dour professorial demeanor would make him unelectable against a popular Democrat. They desperately sought a challenger, a hero who could stop Taft. They found their man in a figure who had never even declared himself a Republican, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the beloved, universally admired Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in World War II. The battle for the 1952 nomination was a bitter, no-holds-barred struggle for the soul of the Republican Party. Taft had the deep loyalty of the party's ideological base, but Eisenhower had the overwhelming love of the American people. At the Republican convention in Chicago, after a series of brutal floor fights over contested delegate slates from southern states, the Eisenhower forces, with their superior media and political operation, narrowly triumphed. Robert A. Taft, Mr. Republican, the man who had dedicated his entire life to the conservative cause and to the pursuit of the presidency, had been denied his dream for the last time. In a gesture of supreme party loyalty, he graciously conceded and campaigned for Eisenhower, but the dream was dead. He would be diagnosed with a rapidly spreading cancer shortly after, and would die just a year later, in 1953. It was a profound and deeply felt generational tragedy. The son who desperately wanted the White House could never get there, while the father who had never wanted it in the first place had it thrust upon him, only to see it end in disaster. The Taft dynasty, it seemed, was destined to be denied the one prize it now truly, desperately coveted. Robert's conservatism was not a matter of political convenience. It was a deeply ingrained philosophy, a direct inheritance of his father's legalistic view of the world, but stripped of the elder Taft's geniality. He saw the New Deal not just as a bad set of policies, but as a fundamental, almost sacrilegious assault on the American principles of individual liberty and limited government. Where others saw compassionate programs to help the poor, Taft saw a creeping, bureaucratic socialism that threatened to smother the nation's entrepreneurial spirit. His opposition was intellectual, consistent, and absolute. This same rigid adherence to principle led him to take deeply unpopular stands, even when it hurt him politically. After World War II, he was one of the few prominent voices to publicly condemn the Nuremberg trials of Nazi leaders. It was not because he had any sympathy for the Nazis, far from it. Rather, as a constitutional lawyer, he was horrified by the concept of ex post facto justice, of trying men for war crimes under international laws that had not been codified when the acts were committed. To him, it was a violation of the most basic principles of Anglo-American law. Much of the country, still reeling from the horrors of the war, saw his position as a bizarre and offensive legal quibble. But for Robert Taft, principle was principle, and the law was the law, even for the most monstrous of men. It was this very quality, his intellectual honesty and his refusal to bend to popular opinion, that made his followers revere him and his opponents see him as a cold, unfeeling ideologue. The 1952 campaign to stop him was a masterpiece of political maneuvering by the Republican Party's Eastern establishment. They feared Taft not just for his policies, but for what he represented, a shift in the party's center of gravity away from the internationalist, big business interests of the East Coast to the more isolationist, small-town conservatism of the Midwest. The slogan of the Eisenhower campaign became "I like Ike," a simple, brilliant, and folksy appeal that stood in stark contrast to Taft's complex, often dry policy speeches. They effectively painted Mr. Republican as a rigid, backward-looking extremist who would plunge the nation back into isolationism and undo the international alliances forged in the fires of World War II. The media, largely controlled by pro-Eisenhower publishers, amplified this message. Taft was portrayed as a dinosaur, a relic of a bygone era, while Eisenhower was presented as the smiling, confident face of the future, the only man who could unite the country and stand up to the Soviet threat. It was a battle of image over substance, of personality over policy, and in the dawning new age of television politics, the dour professor from Ohio never stood a chance against the universally beloved war hero. In the end, what makes the story of Robert A. Taft so compelling is the profound sense of what might have been. Unlike his father, who was content in the world of law, Robert was a man born for the political arena. In private, the cold public image melted away. He was known to be a devoted husband and father, a man with a dry wit and a deep, if rarely shown, personal warmth. His relationship with his wife Martha, who was crippled by a stroke in his later years, was one of incredible devotion. He personally lifted her in and out of her wheelchair and tended to her needs with a gentleness that would have shocked his political adversaries. He was a man of immense integrity and profound conviction. Had he won in 1952, the entire trajectory of the Republican Party and American conservatism would have been different. The activist, grassroots conservatism that would later find its champion in Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan might have come to power a decade earlier. His repeated failures to grasp the ultimate prize represent more than just a personal tragedy. They mark a crucial turning point in American political history, the last stand of an older, more constitutional conservatism before the rise of the media-driven, personality-focused politics that would define the rest of the 20th century. But while Robert's story was one of tragic, unfulfilled ambition, his father's story had a final, remarkable, and deeply redemptive third act. After his crushing and humiliating defeat in the election of 1912, William Howard Taft did not fade into bitter obscurity or spend his remaining years nursing his political wounds. Instead, he did something remarkable. He appeared to be the happiest man in America. He gracefully accepted a professorship of constitutional law at his beloved alma mater, Yale Law School, where he became one of its most popular and respected teachers. He had returned to his first and truest love, the law. He was finally free from the relentless burdens of political life, free from Nellie's driving ambition, and free from the long, imposing shadow of Theodore Roosevelt. He was, by all accounts, deeply and profoundly content. Then in 1921, the dream he had cherished since he was a young man, the dream he had twice sacrificed for a political career he never truly desired, finally came true. President Warren G. Harding, in a move widely praised across the political spectrum, nominated him to be the 10th Chief Justice of the United States. The Senate confirmed him with little opposition. For William Howard Taft, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated, almost transcendent joy. He had finally achieved the one job he had always believed he was born to do. The truth is, he wrote to a close friend shortly after taking his seat, that in my present life, I don't remember that I ever was president. In his mind, his 4 years in the White House were merely a long, unpleasant detour on the road to his true destination. He threw himself into the role of Chief Justice with a passion, an energy, and a sense of purpose he had never consistently displayed in the White House. He proved to be a brilliant and surprisingly effective administrator. His greatest and most lasting contribution was not in his jurisprudence, but in his modernization of the federal judiciary itself. He streamlined the court's procedures, brought a new sense of collegiality and efficiency to its internal operations, and, most importantly, he successfully lobbied Congress to pass the Judiciary Act of 1925, often called the Judges' Bill. This landmark piece of legislation gave the Supreme Court almost complete discretion to decide which cases it would hear, transforming it from a court of appeals obligated to hear a wide range of cases into the modern, powerful institution it is today, one that selects cases of major national importance. He also spearheaded the effort to build the Supreme Court its own magnificent building, giving the court a physical home and a symbol of its status as a co-equal branch of government. As a jurist, he was a moderate conservative, a believer in precedent and judicial restraint. But his true gift was as a consensus builder, beloved by his colleagues. From the arch-conservative Willis Van Devanter to the great liberal dissenter Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., for his warmth, his generosity of spirit, and his good humor. He served as Chief Justice for 9 years, a period he later described as the happiest of his life, until his failing health forced him to retire in early 1930. He died just a month later. It was a profoundly peaceful and deeply fulfilling end to a tumultuous and often unhappy public life. He remains the only person in American history to have held both the nation's highest executive office and its highest judicial office. But the true triumphant story of William Howard Taft is the story of a man who found his greatest success, his deepest happiness, and his most lasting legacy, not in the awesome power of the presidency, but in the quiet, ordered majesty of the law. He had won the world, but it was only in renouncing that world that he truly found himself and fulfilled his own destiny. It was the family's greatest and most personal triumph. His jovial nature completely transformed the atmosphere of the court, which had often been a place of stiff formality and simmering rivalries. Taft made it a point to foster a sense of family among the justices, encouraging them to lunch together and personally visiting them at home if they were ill. His booming laugh would echo through the court's chambers, breaking the tension during contentious conferences. He famously remarked that he had to massage the views of his colleagues to bring them around to a consensus. This collegiality wasn't just for show, it was a key part of his judicial strategy, allowing him to preside over a remarkably unified and efficient court. He even initiated a new tradition, having all 9 justices shake hands with each other before every conference and every session on the bench, a ritual that continues to this day as a symbol of their shared purpose despite their personal or philosophical differences. Taft's vision for a powerful independent judiciary was literally cast in stone. For its entire history, the Supreme Court had been a sort of governmental nomad, holding its sessions in various rooms in the Capitol building, most recently in the cramped old Senate chamber. To Taft, this was an unacceptable symbol of the judiciary's subservience to the legislative branch. He argued, lobbied, and cajoled Congress for years, insisting that the court needed its own temple, a building that would embody its status as a co-equal branch of government. He personally oversaw the commission that chose Cass Gilbert as the architect and supervised the design of the magnificent neoclassical building we know today. Though he would not live to see its completion, the majestic Supreme Court building, with its grand marble columns and the inscription "Equal Justice Under Law," is as much a monument to Chief Justice Taft's vision as it is to the law itself. While he was primarily an administrator, his judicial philosophy was clear and consistent. He believed deeply in a strong central government and in the power of the executive branch, a view ironically more aligned with his old friend Roosevelt than with his own cautious presidency. In the landmark 1926 case Myers v. United States, Taft wrote a sweeping majority opinion that affirmed the president's authority to remove executive branch officials without the approval of the Senate. It was a powerful defense of executive independence, and one can almost hear the voice of the former, frustrated president finally having his say, articulating a vision of presidential power from the safety and comfort of the Chief Justice's chair. It was a ruling that dramatically strengthened the presidency for all who would follow him. The final years of his life were a quiet race against his own declining health. His weight, a lifelong struggle, contributed to heart problems, yet he clung to his work with a fierce devotion. Associates noted that even as his body weakened, his mind remained as sharp and his spirit as cheerful as ever. When it became clear he could no longer perform his duties, his resignation was a moment of profound quiet dignity. He had achieved everything he had ever truly wanted. He had not only reached his promised land, but had reshaped it for generations to come. His dual career is a unique monument in the American landscape, a testament to the idea that the greatest power does not always reside in the highest office, but in the place where one's passion and purpose finally perfectly align. After the towering historic heights reached by William Howard Taft and the fierce ideological battles waged by his formidable son Robert, the ongoing story of the Taft dynasty becomes one of a long, slow, and graceful fade from the national stage. The intense fire of ambition that had burned so brightly and with such consequence for 2 generations began to cool, replaced by a quieter, more modest, and more local sense of public service. The name still carried immense weight and prestige, especially in their home state of Ohio, but the era of the Tafts as a dominant, history-shaping force in national politics was drawing to a close. The succeeding generations were honorable echoes of a powerful past, not the ambitious architects of a new future. The other children of President Taft had already chosen paths that led them far away from the blinding glare of national politics. His only daughter, Helen Taft Manning, became a distinguished academic, a respected professor of history, and a dean at the prestigious Bryn Mawr College. She carved out her own significant legacy in the world of education, dedicating her life to shaping young minds rather than public policy. His younger son, Charles Phelps Taft II, named for his powerful uncle, became a much-admired reformist mayor of Cincinnati. He was a liberal Republican in the mold of his uncle, known for his unimpeachable integrity, his deep Christian faith, and his tireless commitment to civic improvement and good government. He was a pillar of his community, a beloved local figure, but his influence by choice remained local. The direct political line of Mr. Republican continued through his son, Robert Taft Jr. He followed his father's well-trodden footsteps, serving in the Ohio State Legislature, and later in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. He was a respected, diligent, if not particularly dynamic legislator, a moderate conservative who faithfully upheld the family's sterling reputation for hard work and integrity. He was a Taft, and in Ohio, that still meant a great deal, but he lacked the searing intellectual firepower of his father and the historic national stature of his grandfather. The dynasty was continuing, but with clearly diminishing force. The torch was being passed, but each time its bright flame seemed to burn a little less brightly. The final act of the Taft political dynasty, the closing chapter of this century-long saga, played out where it had all begun, in the state of Ohio. Bob Taft, the son of Robert Taft Jr., and the great-grandson of the president, was elected governor of Ohio in 1998, winning a second term in 2002. He was a mild-mannered, competent, and somewhat bland administrator, a technocrat who seemed to embody the family's traditional virtues of sober, responsible public service. For a time, it seemed a fitting, if quiet, continuation of the family legacy. He governed with a steady hand, focusing on education and economic development. But then, in 2005, the long, honorable story came to a quiet, almost pathetic, and deeply tarnishing end. Governor Bob Taft was charged with 4 criminal misdemeanors for knowingly and repeatedly failing to disclose dozens of gifts he had received while in office, many of them from a rare coin dealer named Tom Noe, who had been a major state contractor and was later at the center of a massive state investment scandal. The gifts themselves were not particularly lavish, mostly golf outings, dinners, and hockey tickets, totaling a few $1,000s, but the ethical breach, for a man with the Taft name, was a chasm. In a humiliating spectacle that made national news, the sitting governor and scion of America's great legal dynasty was forced to appear in court. He pleaded no contest to the charges. He was convicted, fined, and forced to issue a deeply awkward and pain-televised apology to the people of Ohio. It was a quiet, almost mundane end to a political story that had begun with such grandeur and consequence. The great-grandson of the president who became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had become the first governor in the long history of Ohio to be convicted of a crime while in office. The scandal was not monumental in the grand, sordid scheme of American political corruption, but its symbolic weight was immense. It tarnished the one thing the family throughout its long history had always held most dear, its reputation for unimpeachable integrity and rectitude. The long, slow fade was finally complete. The Taft dynasty, as a vital and consequential force in American political life, was over. The paths chosen by Helen and Charles II were, in their own way, a quiet rebellion against the crushing expectations of the family name. They had witnessed firsthand the immense personal toll that national politics had taken on their father and their brother. They saw the public humiliation, the brutal betrayals, and the relentless scrutiny. Instead of seeking to reclaim that national stage, they chose to build legacies on a more human scale. Charles, in particular, became a fascinating figure. He was everything his famous brother Robert was not: a progressive, an internationalist, and a champion of organized labor, who served as the first president of the Federal Council of Churches. He was a Taft who broke the political mold, proving that the family's commitment to public service could manifest in ways other than conservative Republican politics. His successful decades-long career in Cincinnati was a testament to the idea that a life of great meaning and impact could be lived far from the Potomac. Robert Taft Jr., on the other hand, accepted the heavy mantle of his father's legacy, but the political world he inherited was vastly different. He was a man caught between two eras. He bore the name of Mr. Republican, yet his own political instincts were far more moderate and conciliatory. He served in the Senate during the tumultuous years of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, a time when the old certainties of his father's generation were crumbling. Colleagues described him as a thoughtful and decent man, but one who seemed burdened rather than empowered by his famous name. He was constantly being measured against his father's towering intellectual reputation and his grandfather's historic stature, an impossible standard for any man to meet. His career was honorable but never transformative. He was a caretaker of a legacy, not the builder of a new one. It's also true that the decline of the Taft dynasty was not solely a matter of personal ambition or political fortune. The very nature of American politics was changing around them. The rise of television, the decline of the old party machines, and the increasing importance of fundraising and charismatic, media-savvy candidates created a landscape that was ill-suited to the Taft's traditional brand of sober, intellectual, and often aloof public service. They were a dynasty built for an age of institutions, of backroom negotiations and respectful debate. They were ill-equipped for an age of sound bites, attack ads, and populist fervor. Bob Taft's conviction was the final sad punctuation mark on a story that had been drawing to a close for decades. It was the end of a particular kind of American public servant, a patrician ideal of duty and integrity that, for better or worse, the modern world had largely left behind. Looking back across the long sweep of the decades, the story of the Taft dynasty emerges as a powerful, poignant, and deeply human reminder that no empire, political or otherwise, is built without a cost, and that no legacy is a simple, uncomplicated inheritance. It is not a linear story of inexorable progress, but a dramatic saga of duty clashing with desire, of public ambition and private sorrow, and of the immense, often crushing weight of a family name that became synonymous with both triumph and tragedy. Alphonso Taft was the architect, a stern man of the Gilded Age who built a formidable foundation of principle, intellect, and ambition. He dreamed of a dynasty that would serve the nation, and his son, William Howard Taft, realized that dream on a scale that was, and remains, almost unbelievable. William was a unique, singular figure in American history, a man who reached the absolute pinnacle of both the executive and judicial branches of government, a feat never to be repeated. He was a reluctant king who found his presidency to be a purgatory, but he was also a brilliant and joyful judge who found his life's purpose and happiness in the hallowed halls of the Supreme Court. His personal story is a profound meditation on the nature of success, forcing us to question our own definitions of fulfillment. He gave the nation decades of honorable, competent service, a legacy of quiet administrative achievement, and a lasting structural impact on its legal system. But that same shining legacy is inextricably, tragically linked to the bitter political fracture of 1912, a feud born of a shattered friendship that tore a great political party apart and fundamentally altered the course of the 20th century. The story of his son, Robert A. Taft, is one of the great what-ifs of American political history, a Shakespearean tragedy of Mr. Republican, a man of immense intellect and unwavering principle who saw his life's singular ambition repeatedly, cruelly thwarted. The dynasty that followed was one of honorable echoes, of dutiful service in a lower key, a long and graceful fade that ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, public shame of a minor ethics scandal. The Taft family's story forces us to confront uncomfortable and enduring questions about the nature of public life in a democracy. What is the true price of ambition, both for those who possess it and for those who do not? Is it nobler to dutifully accept a crown you do not want, or to relentlessly pursue the calling that lies deep in your own heart? And what happens to a great and powerful dynasty when the ferocious fire of that initial world-conquering ambition finally, inevitably, burns itself out, leaving only the warm embers of a famous name? The story of the Taft family is not just about the making of a president or chief justice. It is about the making of modern America. It's about the complexities of family, the immense and often unbearable burden of inheritance, and the eternal universal tension between the life we are given and the life we ultimately choose for ourselves. As the name now resides quietly and respectfully in the annals of history, it leaves behind the powerful ghosts of its past, the genius of the reluctant president, the unfulfilled dreams of Mr. Republican, and the quiet, honorable struggles of the generations who were destined to live in their formidable, inescapable shadows. Their journey is a uniquely American story, one of immense achievement and profound melancholy, a story that is truly and finally complete. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Taft dynasty. It's a story that reminds us that in the grand ledger of history, the greatest titles and the highest offices are often just the public face of a much more complicated, much more conflicted, and much more human story. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that look behind the legends. We'll see you next time.